Oh my.
Might not seem so big after all.
Clean groundwater running low. The world's largest aquifers depleting at alarming rates. Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff.
And I'm Gwen Eichel. Also ahead this Wednesday, will the Supreme Court uphold or scrap health care subsidies? The high stakes for Americans who wait for the High Court's decision.
If the subsidy is taken away, it's life and death for me. So, it's like a ticking time bomb.
Then the U.S. advances into elimination rounds. What to watch as the knockout phase begins for Women's World Cup soccer.
Plus,
The internet in Cuba is very much a luxury for those who can afford it.
life disconnected in Cuba. Internet access slowly expands, but remains too expensive for most.
They recognize the need for Cuba to be connected to the globalized economy. They're taking it piecemeal, day by day.
Those are some of the stories we're covering on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
The Federal Reserve sent the clearest signal yet today that interest rate hikes are coming this year. The Fed's Open Market Committee reported economic activity is strengthening again after a slump in the first quarter. Fed Chair Janet Yellen said the key is what happens in the next few months.
Most participants are anticipating that a rate increase this year will be appropriate. Now, that assumes, as you can see, that they're expecting a pickup in growth in the second half of this year and further improvement in labor market conditions.
The Fed policymakers meet again in late July.
President Obama and top Republicans are set to resurrect a trade bill. GOP leaders say the House of Representatives will vote again tomorrow on giving the president streamlined negotiating power to finish an Asian trade pact. That authority had been attached to a measure aiding workers that Democrats blocked last Friday. The new plan calls for attaching the worker aid to a separate bill. AT&T has been slapped with a $100 million fine over its unlimited data plans. The Federal Communications Commission ruled today the company should have told consumers that transmission speeds would slow down once usage reached certain levels. AT&T insisted that it has been fully transparent and will challenge the fine.
Pentagon leaders warned today the U.S. is falling short in training Iraqis to fight the Islamic State group. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter blamed a lack of recruits. He projected 7,000 fighters by fall instead of the hoped for 24,000. Carter appeared at a House hearing with General Martin Dempsey, the chair of the Joint Chiefs, said sending American troops to the front is not the answer.
I would not recommend that we put U.S. forces in harm's way simply to stiffen the spine of local forces. If their spine is not stiffened by the threat of ISIL on their way of life, nothing we do is going to stiffen their spine.
President Obama is sending another 450 troops to advise the Iraqis on a counteroffensive to retake the city of Ramadi.
In Yemen, Islamic State supporters claimed a series of bombings today in the capital Sana'a that killed 4 people and wounded 60. The targets were 2 Shiite mosques and 2 offices of the Shiite rebels who control the city. ISIS now joins half a dozen factions fighting each other in Yemen.
Hundreds of Syrian refugees have begun returning from Turkey after Kurdish fighters reclaimed their hometown from ISIS forces. Control of Tal Abyad cuts a vital supply line to Raqqa, the militant's self-proclaimed capital. Refugees lined up at a Turkish border crossing today, waiting to cross back into Syria. About 23,000 fled to safety during the fighting.
Russia and NATO traded verbal volleys today over expanding the Russian nuclear arsenal. President Vladimir Putin on Tuesday announced the addition of more than 40 intercontinental ballistic missiles, and he talked of overwhelming Western defenses. Today's NATO staged exercises in Poland, its overall commander sharply criticized the Kremlin's actions and words.
What we have done in this exercise is exactly responding to and our way of being ready for this kind of irresponsible rhetoric. We see these kind of words, normal and responsible nuclear powers don't act like this, don't talk like this.
Putin's missile announcement followed word that the U.S. will station heavy weaponry in Eastern Europe, but his top foreign policy advisor insisted today that Russia is not entering an arms race with the West.
At the Vatican, Pope Francis appealed to critics today to listen to his views on climate change. He'll issue a lengthy encyclical on the issue tomorrow. According to a leaked version, he'll argue that burning fossil fuels is driving global warming. At his weekly general audience today, the pontiff aimed his remarks at climate change skeptics.
Questa nostra casa.
This home of ours is being ruined, and that damages everyone, especially the poor. This is then an appeal on my side towards responsibility. I ask everybody to welcome this document with an open spirit.
The encyclical could be the most controversial since 1968, when Pope Paul VI enshrined the Church's ban on birth control.
Cybersecurity researchers in Germany are sounding a new alarm over thousands of popular mobile software applications, or apps. They said today the way most apps store data could make it easy for hackers to find passwords, physical addresses, and other information. The German team says that so far, there's no evidence that anyone has tried to exploit the weakness.
On Wall Street, stocks managed small gains after an up and down day. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 31 points to close above 17,930. The Nasdaq added 9 points and the S&P 500 gained 4.
And the Golden State Warriors returned home to California after winning their first national pro basketball championship in 40 years.
Still to come on the NewsHour, unsustainable stress on water resources worldwide. Americans await a Supreme Court decision over healthcare subsidies. 2 looks at soccer worldwide. Elimination rounds begin at the Women's World Cup, plus a profile of Nepalese migrants building stadiums in Qatar. Connecting Cubans to an open, affordable internet. Why more cities are banning the box that requires job applicants to disclose their criminal records, and how a few Pakistani doctors are trying to change cultural views of mental illness.
Hundreds of millions of people around the world depend on the use of underground rock formations, known as aquifers, to get the clean water they need. But a pair of new studies show many of the largest aquifers are being depleted at alarming rates. As seen on this map, of the 37 largest ones in the world, 21 are losing more water than is being replaced, with those areas in orange and red showing much more serious problems with depletion. These are located in countries like China, Russia, and Australia, as well as India, where water resources are already a major problem. The reports also identified declining levels for California's Central Valley Aquifer. Jay Familietti is a lead author on one of the reports from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and he joins me now. Welcome, Mr. Familietti. Remind us, what is an aquifer and how does it produce the clean water?
An aquifer is an underground soil or rock unit that contains water in its pore spaces, and the way we get at that water is by drilling wells and pumping it up from the subsurface.
So what did these 2 studies find?
We found that in the 37 world's largest aquifers that we looked at, that over 21 of them are past sustainability tipping points, meaning that the rate of withdrawal exceeds the rate of replenishment. And of those, we found that 13 are in a pretty bad way and threatened to exceed a point at which they may not come back.
And why is this happening?
Well, we rely heavily on groundwater, but yet we don't manage it very well. Around the world, we use about 2 billion people rely on groundwater as a primary water source, and it provides about half of the water that we need to irrigate agriculture. So we rely on it heavily. but we don't manage it very well, and that's true in the United States as well as around the world.
So is this depletion happening at a faster rate than it did historically?
In some places, yes. It's taken a while for the population in a particular region to develop, or it's taken a while for the infrastructure to come into place. For example, in northwestern India, the Green Revolution is something that didn't start until the 1960s and the 1970s. Prior to that, there wasn't much groundwater depletion.
Let's talk for a minute about where this is happening. We mentioned on several continents. Where is the problem the worst?
Probably the worst in the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula, and even the region above the Arabian Peninsula, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran are regions that we've studied before. Northwestern India and really across northern India and into Bangladesh is in pretty rough shape. The North China Plain, the big aquifer system around Beijing, it is true, it's on every continent. The Pilbara mining region, which is the Canning Basin in northwestern Australia. Several of the aquifers in Africa are in rough shape because there's very little rainfall there in the Sahara Desert, so not very much replenishment. And in Argentina, the Guarani aquifer, and then of course the aquifers in the United States, the big ones being the Central Valley and the High Plains or the Ogallala aquifer.
And what about the one in California's Central Valley? What shape is that in?
Well, that's in pretty rough shape. This study and other studies that we've done on the aquifer show that we've been losing about 5.5 trillion gallons of groundwater per year for the last 4 years during this drought. And that's because in California right now, there's no snow in the mountains, there's no rainfall happening, there's very little water in our reservoirs. So we have to rely on this groundwater, and it's disappearing pretty rapidly.
Is there a way of knowing when this water is going, how much more water there is, when it's going to run out, and is there anything that can be done about this?
So that's an excellent question. That was really the topic of the second paper, and so we tried to expose the fact that we really don't know how much water we have in the world's major aquifers. Again, it's true in the United States, and it's true around the world. We know that we're past these sustainability tipping points. All kinds of ecological damage is occurring, and we know that the water tables are falling and wells are running dry. So I think it's very important that we think very carefully about exploring the world's major aquifers to understand how much water is actually there.
Well, it's a grim set of findings that I know a lot of people are going to be paying close attention to. Jay, family Yeti, I thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Before the month is out, the Supreme Court is expected to issue a decision that could determine the fate of much of the Affordable Care Act, often referred to as Obamacare. That case, King versus Burwell, will determine whether subsidies the government provides to purchase health insurance are legal. Nearly 36 states use the federal exchange, and the case is whether subsidies used in those states are valid. To illustrate some of the concerns at stake, we spoke to 3 people now receiving Affordable Care Act coverage about how the Supreme Court decision might change their lives.
My name is Julie Hamilton. I live in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm currently receiving a subsidy through the Affordable Care Act. The subsidy is very important to me because about a year ago, I was diagnosed with mesothelioma, which is a very serious form of cancer. And in my case, affected my lung. I had to seek an expert at Duke University, and he prescribed treatment, which included chemotherapy and an operation to remove my left lung. Since the treatment was prolonged and I was sick during my chemotherapy, I was receiving short-term disability. But when that ran out, my company was forced to let me go. And I went on disability insurance. I decided to keep my company's insurance through COBRA, but I was having a hard time affording the premium. In November, I went to a workshop that explained the Affordable Care Act, and there were counselors there that helped me get signed up and choose a plan. They also explained to me the subsidy that I qualified for. With my $498 subsidy, the premium comes down to $137 a month, which I can afford. As I'm watching the Supreme Court, as they're making their decision, I'm feeling very anxious about losing my health care because I will need follow-up care for the rest of my life.
My name is Michael Cole. I live here in Belleville, Michigan, which is a suburb of either Ann Arbor or Detroit, depending on how you look at it. The ACA has affected me in a negative way. My premiums have gone up from $300 a month back in 2010 when the law was started, up to $850 a month now for actually less insurance than I had previously. I had to make some tough decisions, and one of them was to close my office in Belleville here and move to my home office, saving about $4,000 or $5,000 in rent, insurance, and utilities so I could pay the additional premiums. I don't have the same choices as the doctors that I used to have. Can't use the same labs for blood testing that I used to. I'm covered for things that I don't need, and I'm paying almost $400 a month or $5,000 a year. The Supreme Court ruling that's coming out soon. What I'm hoping for that out of that decision is that the Congress and the President actually sit down and negotiate a bipartisan fix for all of this.
My name is Vanita Johnson. I live in Highland Park, Michigan, along with my daughter, Candace Walker. I am a security officer at the College of Creative Studies in Detroit, Michigan, and I receive subsidies from the Affordable Health Care. I worked for Detroit Public Schools for 10 years, and I had Blue Cross and Blue Shield, which my employer paid for. I had full coverage. I had very good healthcare insurance, not only for myself, but also for my children. And as of July the 30th, 2010, my employment was terminated, and I lost all my healthcare insurance, not only for myself, but for my children also. I couldn't afford the COBRA, so I had to go without insurance for 3 years. It was devastating. I couldn't go to the doctor. I needed medication to control my high blood pressure, my allergies, and my acid reflux. And I couldn't afford to go to the doctor. When the Affordable Health Care started, I signed up right away. I called the number, and they walked me all the way through it. I was able to go to the doctor on a regular basis. I was able to get my medication. I was also, my daughter was able to have her surgery. She had this, they discovered a lump on her breast. So she was able to get that done. So it was liberating, you know, it took a weight off of me. As I look at this, the King versus Birdwell, and how it will affect me and my child. If they decide to stop the subsidies, I won't have insurance. I'll be back at step one, like I was back in 2010.
Now, joining us for a broader view of the stakes for millions of Americans is Julie Robner, who covers this for Kaiser Health News. So, Julie, start by telling us what those voices we just listened to are basically telling us.
Well, they're representative of a couple of things. One is that there have been winners and losers with the Affordable Care Act, and that if the Supreme Court were to strike down the subsidies in the states that are using healthcare.gov, the federal exchange, there would be a different set of winners and losers. So it would definitely shake things up quite a lot.
So we're talking about three basic issues here. Pre-existing conditions, which of course is the part the administration likes to talk about. Subsidies, support for people who can't otherwise afford to pay. And then the concern about the premiums, whether premiums are becoming too expensive.
That's right. I mean, this has always been sort of seen as a three-legged stool, as they say. In order to allow people who have pre-existing conditions to get coverage, you have to get a bigger pool. You have to get healthy people. In order to get healthy people to be able to afford insurance, you have to give them the premium subsidies. If you knock out any one of those, it makes the other two work not so well.
Let's take a couple of additional questions from those folks we just heard from. The first is Julie Hamilton. We just heard her talking about subsidies. Let's hear her question.
If the Supreme Court decides that subsidies can't continue in states like Virginia, how soon will my subsidy end?
This is the source of a lot of debate. Generally, Supreme Court decisions take effect 25 days after they're issued. That gives the losing party time to basically go back and ask them to reconsider. There's been a lot of talk about this. There has been a 90-day grace period for some people, but those are people with subsidies. So if you have a subsidy, then you get 90 days before they can end your insurance. In this case, though, these people won't have subsidies anymore. So most of them will only get whatever their state allows. That's normally 30 days. So basically 30 days after you don't pay your premium, which for most people in this case would be August 1st, then insurance companies would start to cancel policies. That would be September 1st.
We have an additional question from Michael Cole, the man who wasn't so thrilled with the way this has been working.
If the Supreme Court rules against the subsidies, when will the system balance out? Will my premiums go down? Will somebody else's premiums go up? Do you see an end to this, or will it create chaos?
Well, I think there's pretty much a consensus that there would be chaos in the markets that would be affected by this. In the states that have their own exchanges, everything would pretty much go along as it is now. But in states, including Scroll State, there would be quite a mess. Mostly premiums would go up. I'm not sure anybody's premiums would go down. What would happen is that people who could no longer afford insurance would mostly drop out. People who are sick and really need their insurance would stay in. So the group of people who are insured would be more expensive overall. And so everybody who remains in that pool, their premiums would go up. It's hard to see whose premiums would go down in that situation. I think what people hope might happen is that Congress might get together with the president and work something out, but even the Republicans by themselves haven't been able to come to any consensus on what they should do if the Supreme Court acts for the challengers. The idea that they could get something that they would agree on with President Obama, I think everybody agrees may be a little far-fetched.
Benita Johnson also had another question.
Do the individual states have a plan if they decide to stop the subsidies?
Well, a couple of them do, but it's not clear how quickly that could take effect. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether states could just write a one-page letter to the federal government saying, you know, we established an exchange on paper and we still want to use healthcare.gov and we'll lease it. There are those who say that if states try to do that, that they'll go back and sue and they'll say, no, that's not right. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and there's, of course, uncertainty about what exactly the court will do, what they will say, which states in particular will be affected. But generally, nobody has a very good contingency plan.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. She asked about the states. I'm curious about the federal government. We have all had conversations with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and the one question she stopped short of saying, what is their plan B? Any better indication of that?
No, and she's been asked several times, including at a congressional hearing last week. The administration's official line is, we don't think the Supreme Court will rule for the challengers, so we don't have a contingency plan. It's not clear whether that's really the case, but certainly there's not very much they could do legally in this situation. It would really be up to Congress to fix it. Congress could fix it with a one-line bill, but nobody thinks they're going to. So the question is what Congress will then do. But it will be, I think, more in Congress's court than it will be in the administration and the states.
Once again, how many people are we talking about affected by this outcome?
Well, we're talking about 6.5 million people in those states that could be affected who have subsidies. The Urban Institute said that there's another 1.5 million people or so who could be affected indirectly because they have their own insurance in those states whose premiums could spike.
Huge consequences at the end of the Supreme Court term, as always. Julie Rogner, thank you for helping us explain it.
Thank you. Next, 2 looks at the World Cup and FIFA, the governing body of soccer. The U.S. women's soccer team has advanced to the next round of play with a win last night against Nigeria. Veteran player Abby Wambach scored the only goal in a 1-0 win. Nancy Armour is covering the Cup for USA Today, and she brings us up to date on the challenges the U.S. team faces. She was in the stadium in Vancouver last night, and she joins me now. Nancy Armour, welcome. How big a surprise and how big a deal was this win last night?
The win last night was huge for a couple of different reasons. Number one is the confidence factor. You want to get out of your group with a win. You want to get out on top. You want to be considered one of the teams that's doing the best. But there's a logistical aspect to this too. Had the U.S. finished second, they would have been looking at flying clear across the country to Moncton, which is in New Brunswick, to play Brazil, which is one of the other contenders for the title. Instead, they'll play here in Edmonton, and they get an extra day of rest. Their game is not until Tuesday, whereas if they had played in Moncton, they would have had to play Monday. So it was a very significant win for them.
So we mentioned the only goal was scored by Abby Wambach. There's a lot of talk going around about her, particularly about her age, at the ripe old age of 35. And yet you wrote today she's the greatest goal scorer to play the game.
Well, she has more goals than anybody else in the game, male or female. And it always seems as though when the U.S. absolutely positively needs a goal, she delivers. She did it in the World Cup 4 years ago, and she did it last night. She also had a couple other chances at scoring, too. So I think we're kind of starting to see her come out of, if you wanted to call it a funk or a slump, I think we're starting to see her come out of that.
What challenges lie ahead for this U.S. team?
Well, the biggest thing is that the parity in the game has just grown incredibly. You're seeing teams like Colombia, Cameroon, not the traditional powerhouses that are doing well in this World Cup. And for the U.S., it's no longer about the fact that they have the better athletes, that they have more depth than anybody else. They have to play better, and there are no gimme games in this tournament anymore. And that's the one thing, they are aware of it, but they've got to really play like that, especially starting now, because once the knockout rounds start, you lose, you go home.
So who and what should fans be looking out for?
Well, they will have the round of 16 game, which will probably be Colombia next week, and then a semifinal or quarterfinal game. They probably won't get their biggest test until the semifinals, but that could be a big one. That could be Germany, which is considered the other favorite for the title.
There's also been talk about another player on the U.S. team, Hope Solo. How much of a controversy is that, and how much bearing on how this team is doing?
The team says that it's not affecting them at all, that this is something that they dealt with months ago, that they're not concerned about it. But there is a lot of public sentiment of, people wanting to know why she is on the team or why U.S. Soccer didn't do anything about it. And as the Americans continue to advance, I think there are going to be more people who are going to be asking that same question and wondering, why she's still on the field. Why does the NFL have a set of rules and other teams, other leagues don't have the same kind of, aren't taking it with the same kind of seriousness?
And we should say there was an accusation of domestic abuse, and that remains to be resolved. Nancy Armour, at this point, how much are the FIFA scandals looming over this Women's World Cup?
Well, it's kind of ironic because FIFA has always very dismissively treated the women's game. They're making the women play on turf during this World Cup, which would never happen for the men. And yet, so this is the first big tournament since the FIFA scandals broke, and it's the one chance that FIFA has to kind of improve its reputation or improve its image with a great tournament. So like I said, it's a little bit ironic that it's coming from the women that FIFA has basically brushed aside for decades, saying, oh, we don't take you as seriously as we do the men.
Well, I know you're watching, and we will be too. Nancy Armour with USA Today. We thank you. Meantime, today in Switzerland, Attorney General Michael Lauber announced that his investigation into FIFA, that is, as we said, the body that governs both the Women's and the Men's World Cup, will include more than 50 cases of money laundering in connection with bidding by the 2018 and 2022 host countries. Qatar was chosen to host the 2022 World Cup, and the country is already building the infrastructure required. Many of the men doing that work are foreign nationals, and some of them work amid conditions that are increasingly costing them their lives. John Irvine of Independent Television News has their story from Nepal.
Qatar Airways has 3 flights a day into Kathmandu. Many passengers are Nepalese workers taking a break from World Cup-related construction jobs in Doha. Outside arrivals, this woman waits for her husband, but for Mina Tamang, it will not be a joyous reunion. When he left for Qatar 6 months ago, she was his wife. Today, she's his widow. A sad sight the authorities didn't want us to film. The husband's coffin laid across 2 baggage trolleys. 27-year-old Shiva Tamang died in a building site accident on April the 19th. To compound his widow's grief, it has taken 6 weeks to repatriate his body. As if a single coffin wasn't bad enough, there were 2 others on the same flight. Again, the bodies were those of young men One had died in a traffic accident, the other from a sudden heart attack. Cardiac arrest is the biggest killer of migrant workers in Qatar. I put it to the Nepalese Minister of Labour that it amounted to being worked to death, but he disagreed, saying it was an orientation problem.
When they finish the whole job, they come back to the room, and then suddenly they open the AC, air conditioner. So that's why in that case, I mean, they have like a heart attack, something like that.
He would not criticize the Qataris because wages earned by Nepalese workers there and elsewhere abroad account for 30% of this country's GDP. The recent earthquake was a national calamity that the Nepalese must try to cope with every day. But every other day, a Nepalese family has to try to cope with the shock and personal tragedy that is the death of a male relative in Qatar. That was the average death rate there last year, 1 every 48 hours. With no work available at home, these Nepalese men are queuing for permits to go to the Gulf countries, including Qatar. Without identifying himself, one worker who's returning to Qatar described ill treatment during his previous stint there.
The food they give us is often rotten. People at my company keep getting poisoned. 3 or 4 are dying every month. This is my first holiday in 3 years. My home was destroyed in the earthquake, but they only let me return here because I agreed to take responsibility for one of the dead and bring his body with me.
Last year, we were invited to Qatar to look at a new accommodation block housing migrant workers. But later, on our own, we find these older, squalid quarters crammed full of Nepalese laborers sleeping 18 to a small room. These are images Qatar doesn't want the world to see. Recently, other British journalists seeking a similar glimpse were followed, arrested, and interrogated. The Qataris claim that significant progress has been made in improving the lot of guest laborers, but Nandita Barua disagrees. She lobbies on behalf of migrant workers.
We haven't really seen any marked changes in the way that the migrant workers are faring in Qatar today as against what their situation was 5 years earlier.
So the World Cup has not been the catalyst for change that you would hope for?
Don't think so. No.
The body of Shiva Tamang was taken from Kathmandu airport to a Buddhist temple for the funeral ceremony and cremation. As monks performed the rituals, the young man's widow passed out and his mother wept. The Qatar World Cup is now under investigation. The FBI and the Swiss are counting the alleged cost in bribes. Nepal is counting the actual cost in lives.
Now to Cuba. Tonight we look at the country's poor access to the internet, the prospects for improvement, and what it means for the state of free speech on the island. It's the next chapter in Jeffrey Brown's series this week on the Cuban evolution.
Classic cars, colonial buildings, whiling away hours on Havana's famous ocean stretch, the Malecon. For decades, Cuba has felt removed from the forward march of time. A sense that's only grown more pronounced in the age of information. In an ever more connected world, it's a strange feeling to take a short flight from Miami and find that this, other than in a few spots, is essentially useless. It's a sense of isolation that's not lost on people we talk to here.
We're missing out on everything, actually. It's impossible to live without communicating, and I don't know how we can continue like this.
The Cuban government says that 25% of its citizens have internet access. Watchdog groups like Freedom House put the number able to link to a free and open internet far lower, at around 5%. Either way, it's one of the lowest rates in the Western Hemisphere.
When I first heard about this place, I was really surprised.
This is perhaps Cuba's only free Wi-Fi cafe, opened in a quiet Havana neighborhood earlier this year by Alexis Leyva Machado, a renowned Cuban artist better known as Cacho. He's personally close to the Castro brothers. Former President Fidel even made a rare public appearance last year to attend the opening of his cultural center. That might explain why Cacho is allowed to offer this space as a kind of art project. It's not clear how long it will continue, but young Cubans are picking the place while it lasts.
I'm here to get in touch with my girlfriend and get some school stuff worked out. I come here to get some information for that.
I come here to get online, to know about my friends, get in touch with my family. And I would love if I could do this somewhere else too.
Why doesn't anyone have a Wi-Fi connection at home?
I don't know, the state maybe?
The internet in Cuba is very much a luxury for those who can afford it today in 2015.
Raul Moaz is executive director of Roots of Hope, a Miami-based nonprofit with branches around the U.S., including in Washington, D.C., where he spoke to us. His group has been working to increase Cubans' access to technology, sending cell phones, laptops, and thumb drives to Cuba since 2008, when Raul Castro began easing restrictions on these consumer devices.
When Cuba legalized the use of cell phones in 2008, they really priced out the majority of the market. So one cell phone would cost around $100. That's 5 to 6 months' wages for any average person on the island. So unless you had family in the diaspora that was able to send you a remittance for that amount, the average Cuban wasn't able to buy that.
After years of painfully slow dial-up service via satellite, in 2013, underground fiber optic cables laid to Venezuela were switched on, allowing Cuba broadband access. Yet today, that access is spotty at best, far too expensive. Cubans can visit 150 or so state-owned telecom centers where they can pay relatively little to send email and access Cuba's internal network, its intranet. They must pay much more to reach the global internet, which they can also do at tourist hotels, where it's even more expensive, around $10 an hour, in a country where the average Cuban earns between $14 and $22 a month.
I don't have a budget to be paying for the internet at the price we have in any other place. It should change soon because we are talking to our new friends in the U.S., the Americans, and hopefully we're going to get there soon, and there's going to be some progress on this.
That's the hope, anyway, that with the new talks, there will be an easing of restrictions for U.S. telecoms doing business here, and new Wi-Fi spots will spring up. Raul Moaz of Roots of Hope says he thinks more of that will come, along with cheaper services, little by little.
Raul Castro takes a very cautionary approach to the reforms he's implemented, particularly around the economy and economic reforms around small businesses. So you open up small businesses in some sectors to some extent with very high taxes. And then once you see that the train hasn't derailed completely and they're still empowered, they open up a little bit more. And I think the same thing is happening with the internet. They recognize the need for Cuba to be connected to the globalized economy. So they're taking it piecemeal, day by day.
But how much of an opening? The government still controls mass media like television, radio, and Granma, the official paper of the Communist Party.
My impression from talking to my Cuban friends is that they're more than just a little bit cynical. They continue to be cynical about what they read in the newspapers, and especially what they see on television.
Joseph Gonzalez, a professor at Appalachian State University who's been coming to Cuba for years, does see people speaking somewhat more freely here, including expressing open distrust of state media.
At the same time, I'm also heard from some of my colleagues at the University of Amana who have official connections that political change is not on the horizon. This is about as far as it's going to go. They want to see economic change, but the government as a whole and the Communist Party in particular is not interested in significant political change.
And for that reason, the government limits the arrival of the internet in Cuba.
Manuel Mons is a 26-year-old blogger and part of a Cuban reform movement called Somos Más, We Are More.
The government doesn't want the internet in Cuba. The government is afraid of having the internet in Cuba. The government is afraid of the day that people actually have true access to the internet.
He and other bloggers like Yoani Sanchez of 14Y Medio, touted as Cuba's first independent digital news site, must send articles abroad via email to be published. Inside Cuba, their sites are blocked. To reach a Cuban audience, they deliver articles person to person on what's known as the packet, external drives that contain articles, TV shows, and movies, a kind of offline Netflix.
I think the internet is fundamental for this change to happen. The quicker the internet comes, the quicker changes in Cuba will come. The majority of young people want a change in Cuba. The majority of young people are against the government. But the majority of young people prefer to keep quiet out of fear.
But you're not afraid?
No, not at all. I think the government is more afraid of me than I am of them.
Mon says more young people must confront their fears and the state, demanding change. Reporting from Havana and Washington, I'm Jeffrey Brown for the PBS NewsHour.
Jeffrey's Cuba coverage continues tomorrow with a look at the booming art market and how it reflects a changing attitude towards small business.
This is the actual pulp, the original pulp of the paper.
Indeed, artists here are positively entrepreneurial. Adrian Fernandez and his partners were able to create this upscale studio after new laws made it possible to buy and sell property.
Oh, thank you very much.
They now sell their work directly to consumers, mostly abroad, avoiding government-run galleries and reaping their own profits.
We deal directly with the people that reach us here, that we connect directly.
Behind every good reporting trip, especially abroad, is a good fixer. These are the men and the women who live and work in the country who help reporters like Jeff gain access to the people you see in our stories. In Havana, that was Josue Lopez. Online, he gives us a guided tour of Havana from a local's perspective. It's a new series we're calling The Fixer's Guide, and you can find that on our homepage.
Now we turn to our occasional series on imprisonment and criminal justice in America. Some Republicans and Democrats are uniting over reform ideas. Tonight in our Broken Justice series, William Brangham looks at a high-profile idea that centers on felons and their lives after prison.
The nation's biggest city, New York, just became the latest in a national movement to rewrite the hiring process and give convicted felons a better chance at landing a job. Supporters gathered a few days ago as the New York City Council voted overwhelmingly to block employers from asking job applicants if they have a criminal history. The law is known as ban the box. It would do away with the question or box on job applications asking if a worker has served time in prison or had a record. The idea is spreading. So far, 17 states across the country and more than 100 cities and counties have passed similar ban the box laws. We get two different perspectives. Daryl Atkinson is Senior Staff Attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and Elizabeth Melito is Senior Executive Counsel for the National Federation of Independent Business. Daryl Atkinson, I know this is not just a matter of public policy for you. This is very personal in your own particular story. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, William. In 1996, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime. I spent 40 months in prison in the Alabama Department of Corrections. I went into prison with a high school diploma. I came out with a high school diploma. Fortunate enough for me, I had a loving family that could provide me food, clothing, and shelter, and I've been able to achieve a certain degree of success. I've gotten my education. I'm licensed to practice law in Minnesota and North Carolina. I was honored at the White House as a champion of change and removing barriers for people with records. But I don't tell that story to highlight any exceptional attributes about me. I believe millions of people who cycle in and out of our criminal justice system can be successful as well if they have the necessary support. So we banned the box in both Durham City and Durham County in 2011 and in 2012. And we've seen the percentage of people hired who have criminal records go up every year without any increases in workplace theft or crime. None of these folks have been subsequently terminated because they committed a subsequent offense.
Beth Melito, what about this argument that if you know someone has a criminal record, that the prejudice against that is just so great that in fact people who have done their time, served their sentence, that they should have a shot at getting a job just like everybody else?
And, you know, these policies, there's a lot of goal behind them. but there's a cost, and for small businesses whom I represent at NFIB, I mean, the cost can be pretty steep. I mean, this is, I say, it's not a good policy in all businesses and all industries, and the one-size-fits-all is very difficult. In many instances, a small business running, a small contracting company, running a small convenience store needs to be able to abort the hiring process sooner rather than later. It's the business owner who's going through the application, setting up the interviews, bringing individuals in, and in certain instances, even by law, federal or state laws, they can't hire individuals with certain convictions.
Daryl, as you've gone around the country and talking to employers, how do you convince them when they might say to you, look, if I'm hiring people for some kind of sensitive work, I might be putting people into people's homes, that I have a duty to know whether or not I can trust this person's actions? What do you say to those employers?
So I'm a dad. I have a 3-year-old. I drop my 3-year-old off at daycare every single day. Would I want to know, or would I be concerned as a parent if one of her daycare teachers had a past history of child abuse? I would. That would be concerning to me. So that particular position may not be suitable for someone with that criminal record history. What we're encouraging employers to do, both large and small, are to do these individualized assessments and not treat all crimes the same, because some crimes may not have any relevance to whether someone is suitable for a given position.
Well, Beth Melito, what about that point? Will small businesses be okay with the idea that you don't ask people about their criminal background check right away? You vet the candidates, and then if you're about ready to make an offer, then you can check and see if it is relevant, as Daryl is saying. Would you guys support that idea?
I support vetting candidates, most certainly, but the employer needs to have the information about criminal history during the interview. The fact that they didn't raise that during the interview, or that there was a gap on the resume that maybe now a business owner is afraid to discuss because they can't talk about criminal history till after they made a conditional offer, is just kind of ludicrous for a small business owner. And then some of the proposals too, and the New York City is one of them too, the business owner then actually has to provide, a written reason as to why it is they didn't hire somebody because of criminal conviction. I mean, that's just going to send people off to an attorney.
Okay, we've got to leave it there. Daryl Atkinson, Beth Melito, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, to Pakistan. We look at one effort to tackle a widespread public health problem that gets scant attention. It's part of our Asians for Change series. Special correspondent Fred Sam Lazaro reports from Karachi.
For decades, Pakistan has been in a state of post-traumatic stress. From the Afghan war, ethnic tension, religious violence, terrorism. The economy, hindered by corruption, does little to reduce the poverty that drives so much of the turmoil. It's enough to drive anyone crazy, and psychiatrist Sadia Qureshi with the Pakistan-based Aman Foundation says that's exactly what it's doing to a lot of people.
About 40% of the population suffers from common mental disorders. Yes, and some informal reports suggest even higher.
57-year-old shopkeeper Anwar Kaskeli presents a classic case.
I wrote to the newspapers for years about why are the basic necessities of life not being provided to people here, like water, roads, schools, especially education.
Between those worries and a growing inability to make ends meet, he says, he simply withdrew.
For 10 years, I couldn't sit for more than 10 minutes. My mood was just down. My joints would hurt. That made the depression worse. This went on for 10 years.
Throughout South Asia, mental illness goes unreported, undiagnosed, and untreated. It's socially taboo, often viewed as a curse from God, not an illness. Patients have often been restrained in chains and subjected to other humiliations, says Dr. Qureshi.
It's very difficult to express mental health symptoms to not only to the clinicians or professionals, but even to yourself and to the families. There's such a stigma related to that, but it's much more acceptable to say you have a headache or a stomachache or a backache for which you can be taken out to get help.
Not that much help is available. Very few Pakistani doctors are trained to diagnose psychiatric disorders, whether acute ones like schizophrenia or common ones like depression. This is a country of 200 million people. For all of them, there are perhaps 500 practicing psychiatrists. In all likelihood, there are more psychiatrists of Pakistani origin working in the United States and Great Britain than there are in all of Pakistan.
And generally in the developing world, in the poor world, we're talking about 1.5 million people per psychiatrist. So,
what is it here in Britain or in the United States?
Oh, it's about 1 per 10,000.
Chris Underhill is the founder of a British-based aid group called Basic Needs, which tries to deliver mental health care despite the challenges. Partnering with local nonprofits, it began running clinics here 2 years ago. No fancy couches here, just a temporary one-room, one-dock psychiatric ward.
Do you get angry a lot?
This recent morning, Dr. Salim Ahmed swiftly dispatched patients, most in follow-up visits. Their prescriptions were refilled a few feet away. Some patients were sent to counseling behind the curtain in the corner.
The team, the community-based workers, they make it sure that they are taking the medications on a regular basis. If suppose they have some problems like some side effects of the drugs, those community-based workers, they communicate with us.
The team he works with is mainly drawn from the local community. With role-playing and skits, ordinary citizens are trained as outreach workers to follow up on patients, to look for symptoms or side effects, and to refer patients back when clinics are held. Families dealing with mental illness are brought together. They get training in skills like sewing, which may earn some income and reduce stress. In Pakistan, the program has already served 12,000 people. The holistic approach, generic drugs and community-based care, has a longer track record in other countries, Underhill says, and it's inexpensive, about $20 to $30 per person per year.
Not just the medication and all of that, but also the rest of our model, which includes an element of encouraging and training people back into livelihood.
Along with antidepressant meds, Anwar Kaskali received a microloan from the Basic Needs program to reopen his tiny store.
All I want is enough for 3 meals a day. I don't want any riches, anything.
Business isn't great and his recovery is still precarious. It might be a metaphor for mental health care in poor countries. It's been a challenge to scale up because it just doesn't seem as pressing to governments as other issues, says Underhill, even though it exacts a huge toll.
Literally, last year, $2.5 trillion came out of the global economy because of mental ill health. Now, bringing that down to the level of policymakers in one country, Pakistan, isn't easy.
He has a similar challenge with many Western donors on whom Basic Needs relies heavily for support.
And if you take one of the big cities in the United States, and you think about the number of people who have mental illness on the streets, I talk to them about the developing world, and they say, but it's right on our streets.
Despite the presence of mentally ill people on American streets, Underhill says the harsh reality is about 3/4 of the 450 million people with mental illness worldwide are in developing countries, and 3/4 of them are untreated. In Pakistan's Sindh province, I'm Fred Sam Lazaro for the PBS NewsHour.
Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at St. Mary's University of Minnesota.
It is graduation season, and our network of student reporting labs around the country have documented the stories of teenagers who have taken an unconventional path to their diploma. Here's a preview.
High school education has taken me to different paths that I did not know that I was going to go through when I was a little child.
Anybody's gonna make a big change in their life, and some more than others. So you just have to look at it the right way, on the bright side of it, and just embrace it.
I was living in the refugee camp. There was nothing there, like nothing at all. I want to work hard right now, so when I get older, I can fulfill my dream.
I think I'm ready. I still got a lot of growing up to do, but I think I'm ready for college. Bring it on, college.
All that and more is on our website, pbs.org/newshour.
And that's the NewsHour for tonight on Thursday, the day Pope Francis makes a historic statement on climate change. I'll have an exclusive interview with Cardinal Donald Wuerl, the Archbishop of Washington. I'm Judy Woodruff.
And I'm Gwen Eichel. We'll see you online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us here at the PBS NewsHour, thank you and good night.
The frontier here and the state demanding change. Reporting from Havana and Washington, I'm Jeffrey Brown for the PBS NewsHour.
Jeffrey's Cuba coverage continues tomorrow with a look at the